Story 1. The Empty House. The first snow of the season had arrived, casting a soft, silent blanket over the small neighborhood. Thick flakes drifted down under the pale glow of the streetlights, turning the world white and still. Inside the old house at the end of Juniper Lane, Alex tucked themselves in for a cozy night. The house was dark except for the flickering glow of the TV, its hum breaking the silence. Their parents had left an hour ago for a holiday party on the other side of town, and the instructions were clear: lock up, keep the lights off upstairs, and go to bed by midnight. Alex didn't mind. At 16, they'd grown used to being left alone in the house, and the first snow was the perfect excuse to unwind with a movie marathon and a bowl of popcorn. But something felt different tonight. The house seemed to breathe around them, the creaks and groans of settling wood more intense than usual. Alex tried to ignore it, but as the minutes ticked by, the strange sounds grew louder. What should have been a comforting silence pressed in instead, filling the room with an eerie tension. Just as they tried to shrug it off, Alex heard something odd, a faint shuffle near the back door. They paused the movie, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft but deliberate. Then a tapping noise, like a branch hitting a window, but the pattern was irregular, as though someone was brushing their fingers against the glass. Probably just the wind, Alex whispered to themselves, brushing off the unease that prickled their skin. But their heart was racing, and the empty house suddenly felt vast and unfamiliar. Pushing down the chill of fear, Alex returned to the movie, forcing themselves to focus. But then, there was another sound, a gentle rattle coming from the basement door. It sounded like someone trying to open it from the other side, the handle jiggling slightly, just enough to be heard over the faint sound of the TV. Alex froze, their eyes darting to the basement door in the kitchen. They could see the handle moving, just barely, in the dim light. They took a shaky breath. Probably just the old house, nothing to worry about, they murmured. But even as they tried to reassure themselves, they felt the icy tendrils of fear creep up their spine. Their hand drifted to their phone, hovering over the call button as they debated dialing their mom. She'd just tell them to relax, to stop imagining things in the shadows. Forcing themselves to act normal, Alex got up, crossed the room, and checked the lock on the back door. Satisfied it was secure, they were about to turn away when another faint sound caught their attention, a low, dragging sound, like something being pulled slowly across the wooden floor. It came from the basement. Alex's heart thudded loudly, every nerve in their body on high alert. They knew the sound shouldn't be there. There was nothing down there but old boxes and holiday decorations. They took a step back, eyes fixed on the basement door as they considered their options. They could open it, prove to themselves nothing was there, or call their parents, which would only lead to them feeling embarrassed when the truth came out. But as the dragging sound continued, accompanied by what sounded like faint, shallow breaths, Alex realized this wasn't just their imagination. Gathering their courage, they grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and took a slow, steady breath. They opened the basement door, feeling the chill draft rise up from below. The flashlight beam pierced the darkness as Alex took the first step down, every part of them screaming to turn back. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended, each step echoing louder than it should have. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to hold its breath with them. The flashlight beam scanned the room, illuminating nothing more than dust-covered shelves and cardboard boxes. A sigh of relief started to escape their lips, but it was cut short. From the farthest corner of the basement, a shadow shifted. Alex froze, the beam of the flashlight catching just a hint of movement. The darkness pulsed, like it was alive, hiding something just beyond the edge of the light. "Hello?" Alex's voice came out small and shaky, barely more than a whisper. No response. But the shadow moved again, closer this time. A strange, rhythmic scratching sound filled the air, as if long fingernails were scraping against the concrete floor. Alex took a step back, gripping the flashlight so hard their knuckles turned white. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The basement fell silent again, but the tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Alex was about to turn and run when a new sound rose from the corner, quiet at first, barely more than a murmur, but growing louder, like a chant or a whisper. It was their name. Lex. The voice was distorted, inhuman, stretching and twisting each syllable with a chilling edge. It sounded like several voices overlapping, each more hollow and distant than the last. Panic surged through them. Alex stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it with trembling hands. They pressed their back against the door, breathing hard, ears straining to catch any sound from the other side. For a few moments, nothing. Silence, deep and dark. Then, a thump. Soft at first, then louder, insistent, like something was pounding on the other side of the door, demanding to be let out. Alex grabbed their phone, dialing their mom's number with shaking fingers. It rang, but there was no answer. Desperately, they called again, each ring echoing louder in the empty house. Just when they thought they might scream, the call went through, and their mom's voice came on the line. "Hello? Alex? Are you all right?" Mom," they stammered, barely able to catch their breath. There's something in the house. I heard it in the basement." There was a pause, then the faint sound of murmuring on the other end. Their mom's voice returned, calm but urgent. "Alex, listen to me. Lock all the doors, and don't go back downstairs. We're coming home right now. Just stay in the living room, okay?" "Okay," Alex whispered, trying to steady their breathing. They locked the basement door, then hurried to the front door and checked the lock, glancing out the window at the quiet, snow-covered street. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But the thumping continued, rhythmic and relentless, growing louder as if taunting them, daring them to open the door. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching into eternity as Alex sat huddled in the living room, clutching their phone like a lifeline. The pounding continued, growing louder and faster, almost frantic, as though whatever was in the basement was becoming desperate. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence fell over the house, deep and oppressive. Alex didn't dare move, barely even breathing as they strained to listen. And that's when they heard it, a slow, dragging sound, moving across the floor, coming up the stairs. Their pulse raced as they realized, with chilling certainty, that whatever was in the basement had found another way out. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a faint, rasping breath. Alex's mind raced as they glanced around, searching for somewhere to hide. Just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, Alex darted into the hall closet, closing the door quietly and pressing themselves against the back wall. The door creaked open, and they held their breath, heart pounding as the sound of footsteps filled the hall. Through the crack in the closet door, they saw a shadow pass by, tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too twisted to belong to anything human. The thing's head turned slowly, and for a brief, horrifying moment, its empty, hollow eyes met Alex's. They bit their lip to keep from screaming as the shadow continued down the hall, moving closer to the living room. Alex waited, barely daring to breathe, until the footsteps faded into the distance. Summoning what little courage they had left, they slipped out of the closet and darted toward the front door. Just as they reached for the lock, they heard a whisper, soft and insidious, drifting through the empty house. "Alex, come back." They twisted the lock, yanked the door open, and ran out into the snowy night, not stopping until they reached the end of the driveway. They turned back just in time to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching them with hollow eyes and that terrible, twisted smile. A pair of headlights appeared down the street, illuminating the figure for just a moment before it melted back into the darkness. Alex's parents pulled into the driveway, rushing out of the car as they saw their pale, trembling child standing alone in the snow. But when they turned to look at the house, it was dark and silent. The basement door was shut tight, and there was no sign of anything, or anyone, inside. That night, as they lay in bed, Alex swore they could still hear it, the soft, insistent tapping at the window, and the faint sound of a voice, whispering their name from somewhere deep in the darkness. And the mystery lingers. This one's all about the atmosphere and that unsettling feeling of something lurking just beyond the light. Let me know if you enjoyed it or want to take it further. Story 2. The Shadows Move. Alex tried to brush off the nagging feeling of unease that had settled over them like a second skin. They'd been looking forward to this movie night for weeks. In the glow of the TV, scenes of cheesy, predictable horror movies played out, the actors screaming in exaggerated terror, running from over-the-top monsters and ghosts. But Alex wasn't laughing at the silliness the way they usually would. Instead, they felt tense, their mind half-focused on every tiny noise around them. The house seemed more alive than usual, each creak and groan magnified in the quiet. The snowstorm outside continued to intensify, thickening the silence. Every now and then, they'd hear a faint shuffling sound coming from the kitchen, or a slight creak above, as though something was shifting its weight in the attic. Alex reasoned that it was just the house settling, but the rationalizations were beginning to feel thin, even to them. Then, just as they started to relax again, the lights flickered. The glow from the television dimmed momentarily before bouncing back to life. Alex glanced around, the sense of calm shattering as their eyes scanned the room. Their heart raced, the steady thud of it filling their ears as they tried to convince themselves it was just a brief power surge. Nothing to worry about. But as they turned back to the screen, something caught their eye, just a quick flicker, barely there, but enough to send a cold chill down their spine. Out of the corner of their eye, they thought they saw a figure dart past the kitchen doorway. It was quick, just a shadowy blur, but it was unmistakable. Heart pounding, Alex sat up straight, squinting into the darkness toward the kitchen. They leaned forward, hoping that what they'd seen was just a trick of the light, some strange refraction or a shadow cast by a tree outside. They were alone. They had to be alone. But the memory of the figure wouldn't leave their mind. It hadn't been a shape they could identify, it was more like a dark, amorphous mass, gliding across the floor as if it had no legs, no feet to carry it. Desperate to calm down, Alex forced themselves to take a deep breath and rationalize. "It's probably just a shadow from the TV," they whispered, almost as if saying it out loud would make it true. They laughed softly to themselves, shaking their head. "Just my imagination." But the silence in the house didn't offer any reassurance. Outside, the snow was falling harder, and the windows rattled slightly as a gust of wind blew by. For a moment, Alex thought about turning on the lights, but they dismissed it. Turning on all the lights would make them look paranoid. Besides, the warm glow of the TV should have been comforting enough. They turned their attention back to the screen, but every nerve in their body remained on edge. Minutes passed, and they started to feel silly. Maybe it really had been their imagination. But just as they were settling back into the movie, the sound of a door creaking open broke the silence. Alex froze. They knew every sound this old house made, and the creak that had just pierced the air wasn't one they recognized. It was subtle but distinct, coming from somewhere just out of sight. They turned to face the direction of the sound, their eyes settling on the hallway that led to the basement door. The basement door stood slightly ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible between the frame and the door itself. Alex's throat tightened. They were certain they'd shut that door. After all, they'd done their usual rounds after their parents left, locking all the doors and double-checking the windows. It couldn't have opened on its own, could it? They felt a rush of icy fear creep up their spine, but they willed themselves to move, inching toward the basement door with hesitant steps. When they reached it, they stopped, listening to the silence on the other side. The basement was cold and dark, a place Alex avoided as much as possible, especially at night. "Hello," they called softly, half hoping for a response, half dreading it. The only reply was a hollow silence. After a moment, they summoned the nerve to reach out and push the door shut, the latch clicking into place with an unsettling finality. But as they turned to walk back to the living room, something new caught their eye. On the hardwood floor, in the faint light from the kitchen, were footprints. They were damp, as though someone had walked through the snow outside and then tracked their way through the house. The footprints started in the kitchen, continued down the hallway, and stopped right in front of the basement door. Alex's mind raced. Had they left the back door unlocked? They were certain they'd locked it, but maybe in their rush to start the movie, they'd forgotten. Taking a deep breath, they walked to the back door, fumbling for the switch to turn on the kitchen light. Their fingers trembled, and it took a few tries, but finally, the light flickered on, casting a harsh glow over the kitchen. The back door was locked. They checked the handle, twisting it just to be sure, but it didn't budge. A wave of confusion washed over them as they realized there was no way someone could have come in from outside. But then, where had the footprints come from? A sinking feeling settled in Alex's stomach. Something was wrong. This was no longer a case of nerves or an overactive imagination. As they turned to leave the kitchen, the lights flickered again, casting the room into brief darkness. When the light returned, Alex nearly screamed. Standing at the far end of the kitchen was a figure, a tall, thin shadow with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its body was shrouded in darkness, almost blending into the walls, but the eyes were fixed on Alex, unblinking, watching. Alex stumbled back, barely able to keep their balance as they tried to process what they were seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching them with a twisted, inhuman smile. Heart hammering, Alex backed up, edging toward the doorway. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. Alex turned and bolted, their feet pounding against the floor as they ran down the hallway toward the front door. But just as they reached it, the door wouldn't open. They twisted the lock, pulled the handle, but it stayed stubbornly in place as if it had been bolted shut from the outside. They felt a presence behind them, a cold, dark presence that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Alex didn't dare turn around, but they could feel the figure looming closer, its icy breath brushing against the back of their neck. In a desperate attempt to escape, they ran up the stairs, slamming their bedroom door shut and locking it. They pressed their back against the door, trying to steady their breathing. But the silence outside was somehow even worse than the noises had been. After what felt like an eternity, Alex dared to check their phone, hoping their parents might have called. But there was nothing, no missed calls, no messages. They were alone. Their fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to call the police, but before they could make a decision, they heard it again, that slow, dragging sound, moving across the floor downstairs. It was louder now, like something heavy being scraped against the hardwood, inching closer to the stairs. Alex's hands shook as they clutched the phone, struggling to dial their mom's number. Just as the call went through, a soft, scratchy voice came from the other side of the door, whispering their name. Alex. They froze, heart pounding as the whisper repeated, stretching out each syllable in a distorted, mocking tone. Alex, come out. The door handle rattled, and Alex took a step back, eyes wide with terror as they stared at the door. They could hear the breathing on the other side, slow and shallow, each exhale tinged with an unnatural rasp. Come out, the voice whispered again, closer this time. Just as Alex thought they couldn't bear it any longer, the noise stopped. Silence fell over the house, thick and heavy. They held their breath, waiting, hoping it had finally left. After a few tense moments, they crept toward the door, pressing their ear against it to listen. Nothing. With trembling hands, they slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the hallway. The hallway was empty. The house was still. But as they took a step out of their room, a shadow darted across the wall, moving faster than any human could. The figure appeared at the end of the hallway, its hollow eyes fixed on Alex, its twisted smile stretching impossibly wide. They bolted back into their room, slamming the door shut, but this time, the figure was faster. It was on them in an instant, its shadowy arms stretching around them, cold and suffocating. The last thing Alex saw before darkness overtook them was that terrible smile, and the gleam of hollow eyes. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the silent witness to the horrors unfolding within the house. In the living room, the television flickered, casting shadows that danced in the empty room. And somewhere deep within the darkness, a voice whispered, "Welcome home, Alex." Story 3. The Unwelcome Guest. Alex's breath was shallow, eyes scanning each shadowed corner as they clutched a flashlight in one hand and their phone in the other. Each creak of the house seemed amplified in the quiet, the stillness so thick it seemed to press in around them. They'd been sure of what they'd seen, a figure, shadowed and menacing, but as they walked through the rooms, it became harder to convince themselves it hadn't just been a trick of the light. They had started in the living room, systematically checking every doorway and closet, convincing themselves they were alone. The kitchen was next, then the back hallway, and finally the basement door. They stared at the door's solid frame, their hand hovering over the knob. They'd been so certain earlier that something was down there, lurking in the darkness. But now, as they opened the door and flicked on the light, only silence and dusty boxes greeted them. The basement was cold, each step echoing in the stillness as Alex swept the flashlight's beam across the room. Cobwebs clung to the corners, their dusty, undisturbed surfaces a reminder of how seldom anyone came down here. They held their breath, expecting at any moment for the shadows to move, for something to dart out of the corner of their vision. But there was nothing. Just as they were about to turn and leave, a low creak came from above. Alex froze, every muscle tensed as they listened. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, the sound of footsteps, slowly moving across the floor above them. Just the house settling, they whispered to themselves, but the words felt hollow, like a lie they didn't quite believe. Inching back up the stairs, they shut the basement door behind them and stood in the empty kitchen, waiting. The silence in the house was suffocating, almost alive. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside, everything was unnaturally still. Then, just as they took a deep breath to calm themselves, they heard it. A soft whisper, like a voice drifting down from upstairs, carrying a single word, Alex. Alex's heart lurched. They'd heard their name, plain as day, but there was no one else here. "Hello," they called, their voice thin and trembling as they aimed the flashlight toward the stairs. Only silence greeted them. The house seemed to mock their fear, the darkness deepening with every passing second. Maybe they were just imagining it, they thought. Maybe it was just nerves. But even as they tried to convince themselves, they felt the cold weight of dread settle over them. Gathering what little courage they had left, Alex slowly crept toward the staircase, one foot in front of the other, their flashlight trembling in their hand. The steps loomed ahead, the darkness at the top thick and foreboding. As they reached the bottom step, they paused, straining to listen. The whisper came again, a soft, mocking echo of their name, curling down from the shadows above. Alex felt a chill run down their spine. This wasn't their imagination. Someone, or something, was calling to them. They forced themselves to take another step, then another, the wooden stairs creaking beneath their weight. The air grew colder as they climbed, each step a battle against the terror building in their chest. By the time they reached the top, their entire body was trembling. The upstairs hallway stretched out before them, dark and silent. Their flashlight illuminated the worn carpet and the closed doors lining the walls. At the far end of the hall, the door to their parents' room stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out into the hallway. Alex's pulse quickened. They hadn't left that door open. They took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe as they moved. As they neared the door, the whisper came again, soft and insidious, filling the hallway with a dreadful familiarity. Alex. The voice was so close now, almost as if it were standing right next to them. Alex's hand shook as they reached out, pushing the door open just a fraction wider. The room beyond was dark, the heavy curtains drawn, blocking out the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty bed, the cluttered dresser, the worn carpet. There was no one there. But as Alex scanned the room, their flashlight landed on something that made their blood run cold. In the corner, barely visible in the faint light, was a figure. It stood perfectly still, shrouded in shadow, its form twisted and unnatural, as though it didn't quite belong to this world. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes gleamed in the darkness, hollow and unblinking, fixed directly on Alex. They stumbled back, barely able to keep from crying out as the figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. The flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as the figure drew closer, each step echoing in the silent room. "Alex," it whispered, the voice low and distorted, as though coming from some far-off place. Alex's heart pounded, their every instinct screaming to run, but their feet felt rooted to the spot. They watched in horror as the figure stretched out a hand, its fingers long and thin, like twisted branches reaching out toward them. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Alex turned and bolted from the room, their footsteps loud and frantic in the quiet house. They didn't dare look back, didn't want to see if the figure was following them. They flew down the stairs, nearly tripping in their haste, their only thought to get outside, to get away from whatever had invaded their home. They reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, their hands shaking so badly they could barely turn the key. Finally, the lock clicked open, and they yanked the door wide, stepping out into the cold night air. For a moment, they stood on the porch, breathing hard, their mind racing as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The snow fell softly around them, blanketing the street in silence, but Alex felt anything but safe. They turned, glancing back at the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, watching them with those hollow eyes. But the house was still, dark and silent, as though nothing had ever been amiss. Just as they were about to turn away, something in the window caught their eye, a faint shadow, barely visible through the glass. It stood just beyond the curtains, still and silent, watching them with that twisted, unnatural smile. With a shiver, Alex backed away from the house, their gaze never leaving the window. They knew they couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was lurking inside. They turned and ran down the snow-covered driveway, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow. As they reached the edge of the street, they pulled out their phone, hands shaking as they dialed their parents' number. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked to voicemail. They tried again, their fingers numb from the cold and from fear, but there was no answer. Desperate, Alex looked around, wondering if they should go to a neighbor's house, if they should call for help. But even as they tried to think of what to do next, a feeling of dread settled over them, a certainty that they would never be safe, not as long as that thing was in their home. They backed away from the house, their eyes fixed on the window where the shadow had been. The snow continued to fall, thick and silent, covering their footprints, erasing any sign that they had ever been there. As they turned and walked away, the house loomed behind them, dark and foreboding, a silent reminder of the horrors that lurked within. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, a voice whispered their name. Alex. They didn't look back. Story 4. The Stranger Revealed. The house lay in suffocating silence, wrapped in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical presence pressing against Alex's skin. They had never felt so small or so alone, and yet, as they reached the top of the stairs, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from it. They tried the light switch, but the power had gone out completely, leaving only the beam of their flashlight to slice through the blackness. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, coiling like dark smoke along the walls, taunting Alex as they edged forward down the hallway. Every fiber of their being screamed to run, to flee this unnatural silence, but some force stronger than fear, some deep, twisted curiosity, propelled them onward. The stranger had been calling their name, watching them, pulling them towards something that Alex couldn't begin to understand. And as much as they wanted to escape, they had to know. With each step, the darkness grew thicker, swallowing the light as it spilled from their trembling flashlight. The door to their bedroom was barely visible, a rectangle of darker shadow in the endless black of the hallway. Alex's footsteps were soft on the carpet, yet every sound felt amplified, like the echo of footsteps from something following close behind. And then, they saw it. A figure standing in their doorway. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face obscured by shadows save for the glint of hollow, staring eyes. Those eyes fixed on Alex, absorbing the light from the flashlight like twin voids. Their presence was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on Alex's chest until they could barely breathe. Alex's hands shook, and the flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as fear surged through them. In that brief strobe of light, the stranger's mouth stretched into a wide, twisted smile, too wide, revealing rows of jagged, shadowy teeth. The figure's smile was cold and predatory, as if amused by Alex's fear, as if savoring the moment. Then, slowly, the stranger raised one hand, fingers long and thin like the limbs of a dead tree. It extended its hand toward Alex, beckoning them closer, drawing them in with a gesture that was both inviting and threatening. The shadows around it seemed to pulse and twist, forming dark tendrils that reached out toward Alex, ready to swallow them whole. They took a step back, every instinct screaming to flee, but their legs felt rooted to the floor. The stranger's eyes held them captive, pulling them in, urging them forward even as terror gripped every part of them. Who are you?" Alex whispered, their voice barely audible, but in the silent darkness, it felt like a shout. The stranger's smile widened, and the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into Alex's bones. The figure's voice was soft, a low, hollow whisper that filled the hallway, curling around Alex like a poisonous fog. "I am the one you left behind," it said, its voice seeping into Alex's mind, filling every corner with a dreadful familiarity. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy, echoing in the silence. Alex's mind raced, searching for meaning, for some memory that could explain the impossible horror before them. But the darkness offered no answers. As if reading their confusion, the stranger took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, gliding across the floor. Alex stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, the light flickering as the stranger drew closer. And then, in that brief moment of illumination, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The figure's face, it was familiar. Beneath the shadows and the twisted smile, Alex recognized something in the stranger's hollow gaze, a reflection of something they thought they'd forgotten. Memories surfaced, unbidden and unwanted, of long, lonely nights, of whispered secrets in the dark, of an old friend that they'd left behind in the hidden recesses of their mind. The stranger's form shifted, flickering between shadows and memories, becoming something both familiar and horrifying. Alex's heart pounded as they realized what they were seeing. The stranger was them. Or rather, it was a twisted, distorted version of them, a reflection of everything they'd tried to bury, everything they'd locked away. The smile was still there, twisted and mocking, but the eyes were now unmistakable. They were Alex's own eyes, hollow and haunted, staring back at them with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through their soul. "Why did you leave me?" the stranger whispered, its voice filled with a mixture of sadness and anger, a bitterness that cut through the silence like a knife. "Why did you forget?" Alex took another step back, shaking their head, unable to look away from the figure in front of them. "No, you're not real," they stammered, their voice barely a whisper. You're just in my mind." The stranger's smile twisted, a look of mock pity crossing its face. "Oh, I'm real, Alex. I've always been real. I am the part of you that you've tried to bury, the part that you locked away, thinking you could forget. But I've been waiting, lurking in the darkness, growing stronger. And now, I am free." The shadows around the figure seemed to pulse, reaching out toward Alex, pulling them in with an invisible force. Alex tried to resist, but their body felt numb, their movements sluggish and weak. The stranger took another step forward, and Alex could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seeped into their bones, freezing them in place. "I've waited a long time, Alex," the stranger whispered, its voice now right in their ear. "Now, you're finally here. And we will never be apart again." In a final act of desperation, Alex broke free of the figure's gaze and bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the dark. They could feel the stranger close behind, its cold presence pressing against their back as they stumbled down the stairs, barely able to see through the darkness. They reached the front door, their hands shaking as they fumbled with the lock. But before they could open it, a cold hand wrapped around their wrist, pulling them back with a grip that felt like iron. Alex turned, heart pounding, to face the stranger, its twisted smile inches from their own. They could feel the cold radiating from it, could see the emptiness in its hollow eyes. It leaned in closer, its voice a whisper that echoed through their mind. "You can't escape me, Alex. I am a part of you. With one last burst of strength, Alex wrenched their arm free and threw open the door, stumbling out into the snow. They didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the stranger was following. They ran, the cold air biting at their skin, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they fled down the street. But even as they ran, they could feel it, the presence of the stranger, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision, waiting in the shadows. It was a part of them, a darkness they could never truly escape. And as they disappeared into the night, they heard the stranger's voice one last time, a whisper carried on the wind. "I'll be waiting, Alex. I'll always be here, in the shadows." And they knew, with a dreadful certainty, that no matter how far they ran, the stranger would always be there, waiting in the dark, a part of them that could never be erased. Story 5. The Final Countdown. Alex's pulse pounded in their ears as they raced down the hallway, their every nerve screaming to get out. They could barely see, the flashlight lay abandoned on the floor, its beam casting long, eerie shadows against the walls as it slowly flickered and died. Every instinct told Alex to run, to get out before the darkness swallowed them whole. But a voice, soft, cold, and dripping with malice, filled the air, calling their name. "Alex, come back." The words hung in the silence, and Alex felt their heart skip a beat, a paralyzing fear locking them in place for one dreadful moment. That voice, it was familiar, yet twisted, like hearing their own echo through a broken mirror. They turned their head, every cell in their body screaming to ignore the whisper, to keep moving, but curiosity clawed at them, daring them to look back. Just then, a low buzz sounded in their pocket. Their phone. Fumbling with trembling fingers, Alex pulled it out, the screen lighting up in the darkness. A text message from their mom glowed on the screen, a small beacon of hope in the oppressive blackness, running a bit late. "Be home in 5. Lock the doors and stay inside. There's been a break-in nearby." A shiver ran down their spine, the message both comforting and terrifying. They needed to lock the door, but more than that, they needed to be far, far away from whatever had invaded their home. With renewed urgency, Alex turned, lunging for the front door. Their fingers fumbled over the lock, shaking as they tried to twist it into place, but their terror made their hands clumsy. Just as the lock finally clicked, a cold, firm hand clamped down on their shoulder. The touch sent an icy shock through their body, freezing them in place. The hand was solid and unyielding, and it radiated a coldness that seemed to seep straight into their bones. Alex's breath caught in their throat as they felt the grip tighten, pulling them back with an eerie strength. Every instinct screamed to pull away, to fight, to scream, but they felt paralyzed, held by an unnatural force that left them powerless. Slowly, against their will, they turned, the world spinning around them as they faced the figure in the dark. The stranger's face was a haunting reflection of their own, twisted and hollow, with eyes that seemed to hold an endless hunger. Those eyes locked onto Alex's, and a twisted smile stretched across the stranger's face, a smile that was both familiar and horrifying. It was like looking into a mirror of their own darkest fears, of everything they'd tried to bury, everything they'd hoped to forget. "Leaving so soon?" the stranger whispered, its voice low and mocking, a perfect mimicry of Alex's own voice, distorted and filled with a malevolent amusement. Alex's throat felt tight, every word caught in a knot of fear. What are you?" they managed, their voice barely more than a strangled whisper. The stranger's smile widened, and it tilted its head, studying them with a look of twisted curiosity. "I'm you, Alex. The part you left behind. The part you thought you could bury." Its voice dripped with bitterness, an accusation woven into every word. "I've been waiting for the moment you would come back to me." The darkness around them seemed to thicken, pressing in closer, suffocating. Alex felt trapped, like they were sinking into a nightmare that had no end, no escape. You're not real," they stammered, trying to pull away, but the stranger's grip tightened, holding them in place. They could feel the cold seeping into their skin, a chill that seemed to drain every ounce of warmth from their body. "Oh, I'm real," the stranger whispered, its breath icy against Alex's face. "I've always been real. You just didn't want to see me. But now, you have no choice." With a slow, dreadful movement, the stranger raised its other hand, pressing a finger to Alex's chest, right over their heart. The touch sent a shock of pain through them, a piercing cold that felt like ice spreading through their veins. They gasped, every nerve alight with agony as the stranger's touch seemed to sink into them, drawing something out, something they couldn't name but could feel slipping away. Alex's vision blurred, the room spinning as the stranger leaned closer, its voice a soft, venomous whisper in their ear. "This is the part where we become one. Where you finally accept what you've tried so hard to deny." "No," Alex gasped, struggling against the invisible weight that held them in place, fighting the darkness that seemed to close in around them, swallowing them whole. But the stranger's grip was unbreakable, a force stronger than anything Alex had ever felt. And then, just as their vision began to dim, as they felt themselves slipping into the cold, a distant sound shattered the silence. The creak of the front door opening, the warmth of light spilling into the hallway. "Alex!" Their mom's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the darkness, piercing the fog of fear that had gripped them. The stranger's grip faltered, its hollow eyes narrowing in anger as it looked toward the light spilling in from the open door. Alex seized the moment, jerking free from its grasp, stumbling backward as their mom rushed into the room, her face etched with worry. What's going on?" she asked, her gaze darting between Alex and the darkness, but the figure was already gone, the shadows melting away, leaving only an empty hallway in its wake. Alex gasped for breath, their heart racing as they clutched their chest, feeling the lingering cold where the stranger's hand had touched them. They looked up at their mom, unable to speak, unable to explain the horror they'd just faced. But as they glanced back at the darkness, they saw it, just for a moment. A flicker of movement, a pair of hollow eyes watching them from the shadows, a twisted smile lingering in the corner of the room. The stranger was still there, lurking in the dark, waiting. And as Alex stared into those hollow eyes, they knew that the nightmare was far from over. The stranger had retreated, but it was still a part of them, a darkness that would never truly go away. And in that final moment, as the shadows closed in, they heard the whisper once more, soft and mocking, a reminder that the darkness would always be there, just waiting. "See you soon, Alex." If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.